Dennis, before decriminalisation, your groundbreaking book, Homosexual, which became huge for the gay liberation movement, you were called upon to talk about it in public with journalists, on television, on the radio. And this was a book which wasn't just a sort of apologetic plea for inclusion and toleration. It was a radical book which argued that, in fact, society itself had to change for there to be sexual justice and progress. So these were very dangerous ideas. And you were 28 years old. This is sort of more than 10 years younger than I am now when you went and spoke about these things in public. I just am curious to know, what was 28-year-old Dennis Altman thinking, getting up and representing those ideas?
Look, I think I'm probably an exhibitionist, and therefore I think I rather enjoyed the chance. One of the things that strikes me when I look back is that there's a certain protection when you go public. And if you think about the possibility of being pufter bashed, and pufter bashing was a real phenomenon in Australia. After all, we're talking about Sydney in the 1970s. You didn't get pufter bashed because you were on television. You got pufter bashed because you were walking along the Bondi Rocks late at night. And in some ways, I think being public made me almost a protected species. The time in which that first book was written was also, of course, a time in which there was a huge amount of social and cultural change going on. And there's no doubt that in Australia in the early 70s, the period Donald Horne referred to as the time of hope, was a time in which it was much easier probably to talk personally, to throw out ideas, to be radical. I actually like to quite contrast that now with your experience. Are there things you now feel we would like to talk about but we can't?
I think there is still a lot of difficulty and stigma attached to people who come out and talk about being sex workers. I think that there is, a lot of risk in talking about being involved in performance and making of pornography. I know that there are a lot of, brave people who stand up and do articulate that experience, but I think that there are a lot more people not doing it. The idea that children or young people, tweens, teenagers have sexuality is still an utterly fraught and anxious topic to discuss. And I think one more interesting one that I often think about and think more about in my current work is the relationship between sex and drugs, and particularly to talk about people who use drugs and, in sexual contexts, and talk about the pleasures involved rather than just the risks or the harms.
Well, of course, if we think of things that are fraught, there's probably nothing that is, at the moment, more fraught than talking about being trans and the huge debates. And this is very different because when I wrote my first book, when what we then called the gay movement, which we now would have to call the LGBTIQA++ movement, began in Australia, there was a very, I think, a marked ignorance about the reality of trans experiences. And in some ways, that to me is the biggest change that's happened in the last 30 or 40 years. But the debates that go on and the sensitivities that trans issues now raise are quite extraordinary, and I think much deeper, in fact, than the anxieties that were raised when we first started talking about homosexuality in public.
I agree completely. And I think even though there is so much kind of post-trans tipping point discussion in the culture, we're still really at the beginning of that conversation. And I think the challenge that trans and non-binary and gender fluid identities pose to, really our culture's most strongly held and fiercely policed opposition between men and women is going to be the real battleground for progressive sexual movements going forward.